an esteemed rabbi, David Wolpe, from Sinai Temple, tells a story of his own mindlessness, his childhood obliviousness. And he was growing up, raised in Philadelphia, and he used to go every summer. They used to go to the shore, which naturally to Philadelphians meant New Jersey. It wasn't Zuma. And when they would go, one time his mother said to him, "David, your responsibility is put the food in the trunk of the car," and he did. And when they got to the shore, the mother opened the trunk and she said, "David, did you bring the food?" He says, "Yes, I did." She said, "Did you put it in the car?" He says, "Yes, I did." She said, "Which car?" And another story he tells is of a time when he was the scholar in residence for the second time with a lapse of a few years at a synagogue. And he came there, and as a scholar in residence, he stayed in the home of the rabbi. And he was in the home, and he was sitting at the Shabbos dinner, and he was there. And at one point, he looked around the room, and he said to his friend, this hosting rabbi, he said, "You've redone the room." And the rabbi looked at him, and he said, "David, it's a different house." So I think with respect, we can laugh because he tells the story so that we can realize and laugh at our own mindlessness. And I think what it is particularly male. Maybe it's something called MAD, Male Attention Deficit Disorder, with great respect to Mothers Against Drunk Driving, who rightfully own that acronym. But think about that idea as men and as people who live with or know or are related to men. We tend to struggle with being mindful. We struggle with being attentive. And maybe it isn't only generational. Maybe it isn't about modernity only. Maybe in the time of Jacob, in the book of Genesis, when Jacob says, "God was in this place and I did not realize it." Maybe that's the first proclamation of male or even human mindlessness. That he says, "I missed this moment. I didn't realize this moment," with absolute radical amazement. I thought I was alone in this field, on this sadeh, with my head on this rock. I didn't realize that I was making this journey with God, that God truly was in this place that I'm now ready to vacate. And only now do I realize the loss of that mindful moment. I have to say that I think the internet blessed us all, but at the same time probably created the least attentive generation in human history. The least attentive generation in human history. And I wonder if, despite the great pleasure of having information constantly at our fingertips, if we, more than one generation at a time, will pay a price for our lack of attentiveness. Because always there's a pull. Look at a couple sitting in a restaurant. She gets up to go to the restroom. He immediately pulls out his phone, fearful of being alone for a moment. So he checks eBay, he checks scores, he checks stocks. He looks to see who emailed him. All of us do that. Look in restaurants, see that couple and that family eating, and realize that almost always now, even in the better restaurants, there are TVs almost the size of the restaurant on the walls. What's the message? The message is we understand. We know that your wife's story of carpools and orthodontists and trips from this place into that place and mahjong and friendships and challenges can't be that interesting to hold your attention for the duration of 2 or 3 courses, maybe with dessert. So what we're going to do is give you a societal excuse for something that's really inexcusable. But remember that when you're looking at the Lakers or the Dodgers on 2 different walls, what you're not doing is realizing where your support actually needs to be. Because Kobe's scoring isn't going to be changed by your support in that restaurant, but your wife's life and sense of self, or your children's, or yours, will be changed by a moment of mindful support and listening. I think about this psychologist, Ned Hallowell, whom some of you may know, because he not only has attention deficit disorder, which he describes, he says, you know what it is sometimes when you're in a conversation with somebody and suddenly you realize you changed channels. They're still talking. And their lips are moving as if in a silent movie. And then you might switch back. But what he says, and the reason why so many of us without ADD or ADHD are also nodding, is he says we have societal ADD. I think today the disorder is attentiveness, not lack of attention. I think we, who are not trying to correct our attention deficit, are suffering because we're not realizing the imperative of becoming more mindful and more attentive. Look around us. Look at the books on shelves. Listen to radio shows, television programs. Listen to wisdom. What wisdom is trying to teach us through knowledge is we need to be awake to this moment because this moment is the only one that exists. Mindfulness is sometimes the realization that emotion is only about the past and only about the future, even when it clouds the present. Think about that idea. That emotion is about the past and about the present and the future, I should say, in relation to the present. So ask yourself in a moment of seeking mindfulness, if you're in that moment or if you're relating it to what might be that hasn't yet been born or what was that's already dead. The rabbis say that when people eat, when they share a meal, they should talk Torah. And maybe this is because the rabbis had an obsession, a compulsion with Torah, with the study, with religiosity, with theology, with betterment of the human soul. Maybe they wanted us every time we engage to also be engaged. Every time we consume to also consume. But at the same time, maybe what the rabbis are teaching us is what they told us centuries ago, that every human being is a metaphor for Torah, to be studied at every meal. That we have the opportunity when we stop to say a blessing, not only so that we realize something about what we're eating, but so that we realize something in our breath and in our heart and in our mind about that moment in which we are blessed to dwell. So that when we say, Borei pri hagafen, Borei mine mezonot, hamoreh et ha'etz, whatever it is, whatever we say in that moment, we're saying, let me be mindful in this split second of what's in my grasp. I'm saying this today knowing that there are teens behind me and around me and kids, your kids, grandchildren, our families, not trying to give a sermon that's about theology or religion or something that only applies to people with a little gray that comes into their beard that they then quickly shave off. Because what I realize is that every one of us might seek wisdom from these services, and every one of us might realize that the simplest habit that we can change in this new year, that every one of us has the capacity to change, is to become more aware, to breathe and to find our breath, to listen and to find each other, to look and to see each other, to realize in this moment that we came for this moment, not the one that was, not the one that will be. To realize that our relationship exists in this moment as it never did in its history, with a new potential that never was. That your marriage, that your relationship with him, that her relationship with her, your children, your grandchildren would depend on you not bringing yesterday's relationship to today, but a mindful awareness of the potential of this moment that's been born. Take a breath for a moment. And instead of simply breathing to stay alive, take a breath to realize breath, to center thought. Realize when a breath goes in and when it goes out. And notice that space between breaths. When there's no life, waiting for new life. No exchange, waiting for an exchange. Realize in that space when your lungs are nearly empty but never empty, that what you're waiting for is a miracle. And then looking around, you realize it came. When we turn away from one another while looking at each other, when we have a telephone under the table while listening to each other, when we stop listening, what we're doing ultimately is saying, you don't matter quite as much as ... That's the message that we get. When we come into our car with one person and suddenly it's invaded by 6, because of the power and speed of text messaging, instant messaging. What we're saying is, this moment isn't sacred enough, so I need to introduce other elements and other people. And what we're saying to ourselves when we put the phone down is, I have that power and discipline and that ability to rule this moment in my life. So what else am I capable of? You see, what our tradition teaches us is to be self-disciplined. Because then we realize if we can fast on Yom Kippur, we can do absolutely anything in the year to come. if we can abstain from the most human thing, which is food and physical relations and comforts, for a 24 or 25-hour period, we're teaching ourselves what we as mensch, not as mammals, are capable of in the year that will follow. So I'm sharing these words with you because I think to myself, if I can share one word or thought that might matter, that might change not only my life but yours, maybe it isn't something about God, but maybe instead it's about looking at us, the simple, practical reality of living in this advanced, extraordinary world. In a moment, I can reach New York or Hawaii or Geneva. In a moment. But how long does it take me to reach somebody sitting 2 feet away from me? In a moment, I can find scores of games that are happening live across the country. But how long does it take, how many hours or minutes or days to actually realize what my wife or what your husband or what your kids are trying to communicate without words to you? If you remember last year, I gave people blue bracelets. And the idea was, and a lot of people, some people are still wearing them. I have some in my drawer if anybody needs. Special edition. They're now vintage. I'll give you one. Anybody else, come and see me. The idea with that was change a habit. Why change a habit? Why 21 days? Because we know in the cycle of human habituation that it takes 21 days to realize a new habit, whether it's about diet or exercise or complaining or not complaining or changing the way that we frame and reframe our lives and our world. And what we're doing here is resetting the hard drive for a new year. That's what it is. We're saying reformat my hard drive. The essence of my hardware and my software. Let's restart, reboot. And what I want to ask us as conscious people, not hardware, metal and plastic, is to think when we do that, before we leave this place, with that reboot in mind, what we're capable of. And what do we want to be known for? And what do we want to strive to do in ourselves? And what do we want to realize in the days to come that will make these hours that we spent not mindless but mindful? You see, we can relearn about Abraham and Isaac and Jacob and a mountain, Mount Moriah, and either we can say, that's not about me. It's about other people who existed thousands of years ago. Or we could ask ourselves in that ancient scroll, what is it trying to tell me? And these words and these prayers and these silent pauses and these songs, what are they trying to evoke in me? What prayer is theirs to me? What is ultimately the message of an hour spent sitting and then rising and bowing and bending and praying? If I was to pray to myself in this moment as the God of my own story, if that's my theology for one moment of this holiday, then what prayer will I make of myself? If you have the opportunity before you leave here in 3 minutes or 4 to make a resolution to change something that has to do with your attention to one another and to the moment, no offense to the marriage and family therapists, but I think business will go down next year. Because what we'll realize is the first thing to do to bring beauty in a relationship is to realize it was there, but we failed to see it. It's to realize that just as God inscribed the word chaim, life, on a tablet called our heart, and we come here once a year to take the chisel to the silt to try and find it again, to ask ourselves, what does it actually mean that I've been blessed with life? What am I meant to do with this? We have the same to ask ourselves in relation to one another. What is it that I'm not seeing because I fail to see what's not covered? What is it that I've allowed to grow over the beauty that was once something extraordinary? When a couple stands under the chuppah, we say a phrase, Began Eden Mikeden, in the Sheva Brachot, in the 7 blessings. And I look at that phrase and I always wonder, why are we saying in these blessings something about the Garden of Eden of days of old? And I think maybe the reason is what we're trying to say to that couple in that moment under that chuppah, surrounded by all those people, is find yourselves alone even for a moment in a garden. Before you go back out into the world to all those people who want to celebrate with you and distract you from each other for the rest of your lives, have a mindful realization of each other. Stand there in Eden as Adam and Eve did before they realized we can't live under the chuppah. We have to journey down that path into a world of challenges, into a world of blessings. So with that, I wish all of you a Shana Tova. I hope it's a year not only of blessing, but I hope it's a year of mindfulness, of the realization of blessings. I hope all of us can look at each other with wide eyes and say, did you see that? Did you get that? Did you experience that? And ultimately, thank you for this experience that we share with one another. Shana Tova.